Okay, to my talk. Thanks for coming. So I want to start by inviting you to think about the following scenario. Imagine you and I are discussing the greatest athletes of all time. Okay, so this is ChatGPT generated. Imagine you ask me what I think about Michael Phelps. So for those who don't know who Michael Phelps is, this is Michael Phelps. So knowing that Phelps holds the record for the most gold Olympic medals, I make the following response to your question. He's not human. Okay. So in this case, it's pretty clear that I'm not saying that he's not a member of the human race. On one interpretation, on a kind of post-Gricean way of thinking about this, what's going on is that I'm using the term human to express what is called an ad hoc concept that is different from the usual meaning of the term human. So he's human here means something like he's not an ordinary human. He's not someone with typical physical or mental abilities. So in saying that Phelps is not human, I'm expressing the sentiment that I think very highly of him. I think he has exceptional abilities that far surpass the rest of us. Okay. So I think this notion of ad hoc concepts has great applications in philosophy. And the reason I'm giving this keynote is because I was lucky enough to win the Annette Bear Prize last year. So in that paper, I argued that some philosophical concepts have this kind of pragmatic origin. They have origins as ad hoc concepts. And there I focused on Thomas Nagel's what is like concepts. So philosophers of mind often use this what is like phrase to pick up the notion of phenomenal consciousness. But what is like has a specific meaning in the philosophical discussion. And that's different from the usual meaning of the term, the phrase what is like in ordinary English. And in this paper, I argued that this has important implications with respect to experimental philosophy that uses this kind of what is like locution as well as similar locutions to test people's intuitions about phenomenal consciousness and the thought experiments about consciousness. Okay. So in this talk, I'm going to use the notion ad hoc concepts for a different purpose. I'm going to use it to think about verbal disputes. Here I'm going to, because I'm a philosopher of mind and language, I'm going to focus on cognitive and linguistic mechanisms underpinning characteristic instances of verbal disputes. Verbal disputes are communicative failures. So in this talk, I'm going to distinguish two kinds of failures. One is what I call failure to recognize, and the other one is what I call failure to adopt. Then, if there's time, I'm going to draw some implications with respect to actual instances of verbal disputes in public discourse, as well as philosophy. Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit more about ad hoc concepts. So this is linguist Robin Karsten at UCL. So Karsten has written a lot about this notion ad hoc concepts, and this is how she introduces the notion. The term ad hoc concept is used to refer to concepts that are constructed pragmatically by a hearer in the process of utterance comprehension. The idea is that speakers can use a lexically encoded concept to communicate a distinct, non-lexicalized atomic concept, which resembles the encoded one in that it shares elements of its logical and encyclopedic entries, and the hearers can pragmatically infer the intended concept on the basis of the encoded one. So there's a lot going on. There are basically two sides to this story. So think about an instance of communication. A speaker says something, and there's the hearer trying to interpret the utterance. So on the speaker's side, one can use a word to communicate an ad hoc concept that is different from the word's encoded or usual meaning of the term. And on the hearer's side, what the hearer does is the hearer can, in a good case, latch onto the intended meaning of the speaker through some kind of pragmatic, inferential sort of process. Okay. So ad hoc concepts are contrasted with lexically encoded concepts. So lexically encoded concepts are concepts that are encoded by our language. So they're going to be more concepts than what our language encodes. So this distinction, ad hoc concepts and lexically encoded concepts, really tracks this distinction that philosophers of language as well as linguists often draw between the standing meaning of a word and its occasional meaning. So the standing meaning of a word is what a word as a type means or encodes, whereas a word's occasional meaning is what a word means on a particular occasion. So this distinction is often drawn in the contextualist tradition. So that's the kind of background assumption I'm coming from. So one way to think about this is to think about meaning as picking out concepts. So the standing meaning of a word picks out a lexically encoded concept, and occasional meaning sometimes picks out ad hoc concepts. And so there are different ways of thinking about concepts. So Carsten and others follow Jerry Fodor in thinking, in sort of holding a atomistic picture of concepts. So Fodor's picture is that concepts are atomic symbols, so they combine to generate complex concepts. So this allows us to explain the compositionality of language and thought. But concepts are also associated with bodies of information. So on this kind of picture, a concept makes available is a kind of an addressee in the memory, which points to a body of information. And there are different types of information or different types of entries that can be stored under the body of information associated with a concept. So Carsten here talks about logical and encyclopedic entries. So logical entries are inference rules, which capture certain analytic implications of the concept. So take the concept human. If something is human, we can infer that that thing is mortal. So that's a kind of inference rule that's stored under the kind of body of information associated with the concept human. There are also encyclopedic entries. So these are basically all sorts of beliefs and knowledge you might have about a particular domain. So think about the concept human, think about some typical beliefs you might hold about human. Humans live on Earth, have families, play certain roles in societies, behave according to moral or social norms, possess certain physical or mental abilities. So in saying that Phelps is not human, what I'm doing is drawing your attention to this very last piece of encyclopedic entry. And in that particular context, that piece of information is going to be easily accessible for you. And given your understanding of the word human and given your body of information, in that particular context, you can infer what I mean by my utterance. Okay. And also with lexically encoded concepts, there are going to be lexical entries, which specify phenomenological and syntactic properties that encode a relevant concept. So human in English is associated with this, is encoded by this phenomenological feature, is associated with this stream of letters. Okay. So the kind of picture is that an ad hoc concept is sort of modulated. It's the occasional meaning that's modulated from the standing meaning, the encoded meaning of a word. So take a word human. The encoded meaning is probably something like, picks on extension, picks on, members of the human race. And in that particular context of utterance, I produced an ad hoc concept, human star, which has a narrow extension, picking out something like ordinary humans. Okay. So in terms of, there are two broad processes, lexical modulation processes. The first is narrowing. So in the case of narrowing, so the human example is a narrowing case. Phelps is not human. That expressed in the ad hoc concept has a narrow extension than the extension of the encoded concept. So in the case of narrowing, the extension denoted by the ad hoc concept forms a subset of the extension denoted by the lexically encoded concept. Think about the lexically encoded concept, members of the human race. The ad hoc concept, he's not human, he's not an ordinary human, pretty much. That picks out narrow extension. What is like locutions in philosophy of mind picks out a narrow extension. So it's a case of narrowing. So in philosophy of mind, what is like picks out a specific experiential way that a subject can get affected by undergoing a particular event. I think about the Mary room scenario. And what is like in ordinary locution can mean all sorts of different ways that a subject can be affected by a particular event. So what is like for the UK to undergoing Brexit or something like that. Okay, so it doesn't have to be experiential way. So it's a case of narrowing. So opposite to narrowing is a case of, it is the process of broadening. So in the case of broadening, the extension denoted by the lexically encoded concept forms a subset of the extension denoted by the ad hoc concept. Two quick examples. England is often freezing around Easter. So it's a case of hyperbola. Freezing here roughly means something like very cold. So that's an ad hoc concept. And the encoded meaning, the literal meaning is probably something like at frozen point. So that's a case of broadening. Okay. Pour out lots of water and the tree will drink it right up. So this is a case of metaphorical extension. So drink here is a kind of narrowing. Sorry, the first example is, broadening. The drink is a kind of broadening as well. So drink standing meaning is probably, take a liquid through your mouth and swallow. I think about drinking water. And drink here means just roughly consume water. So plants can drink water. So it's a case of broadening. And sometimes narrowing and broadening can happen at the same time. One good example is in the case of a Jew character concept. So a number of philosophers in recent literature have noted that when it comes to social kind terms like philosopher, scientists, and women, these words seem to express Jew character concepts. So they can be used descriptively, philosopher, picking out profession, philosopher by description, and they can also be used normatively to pick out some kind of ideal that a particular social group embodies. So one way to think about this is that maybe the descriptive sense is the kind of encoded sense, and the normative sense undergoes narrowing and broadening. So pick the word philosopher. The normative sense is narrower than the descriptive sense, in the sense that the normative sense excludes some philosophers by description who fail to embody the relevant ideal of being a philosopher. But the normative sense is also broader than the descriptive sense, in the sense that it includes members of the society who embody the ideal of being a philosopher, but fail to be philosophers by description. So you can describe a 5-year-old as an inquisitive 5-year-old as a philosopher, a real philosopher. Okay. Am I losing people? Oh, good. All right. All right. Polysemy. So ad hoc concepts are really closely related to polysemy. So polysemy is a linguistic phenomenon where a word has multiple distinct but related senses. And polysemy is extremely widespread. So when it comes to frequently used words in English, estimation is about 80% of frequently used words in English are actually polysemous. So polysemy allows us to expand our vocabulary without having to invent new lexical items. Okay. So the idea is that once an ad hoc concept, so ad hoc concept is kind of pragmatic thing. Once an ad hoc concept is repeatedly used and conventionalized, the relevant word then takes on a newly encoded sense and becomes polysemous. Okay. Two very quick examples. After years of attending AA meetings, Teresa finally quit drinking. Drinking here means drinking alcohol. And that's a kind of standard kind of sense of the word. It's a polysemous word. And presumably the origin is a kind of narrowing process, right? So it has its origin as an ad hoc concept. Johnson is such a child, assuming it's Boris Johnson. Child here means immature person, right? That's a standard use of the term. And that's a case of, the origin would be a kind of a broadening, right? The child, the original sense gets broadened to describe adults as well. Okay. So the distinction here isn't really particularly sharp. So you can think about ad hoc concepts as one-offs and the polysemous words as kind of conventional. The senses are conventionalized, routinized. Okay. So that's polysemy. I want to move on to verbal disputes. So let me just clarify what I mean by verbal disputes. So in an instance of a verbal dispute, the relevant parties seem to disagree with each other about a particular domain of concern. So imagine two people disagreeing about whether, say, Mel Gibson has been cancelled, right? But in reality, they don't actually disagree on important facts. They actually agree on relevant facts pertaining to the domain. So they might very well agree what has happened to Mel Gibson. But the dispute depends, at least partially, on how the relevant parties use language in describing the domain of concern. So they might very well disagree over whether they want to use the term cancelled to describe what has happened to Mel Gibson. Okay. So given what I said about ad hoc concepts and polysemy, they're very common occurrences in ordinary conversations. So one might expect ad hoc concepts and polysemy to give rise to verbal disputes. So in many instances of verbal disputes, a speaker is either using a polysemous word in one of its conventionalized senses or using a word to communicate an ad hoc concept that is different from the lexically encoded meaning. So that's one side of the story. And on the hero side, the hearer either fails to recognize the meaning of the word intended by the speaker. So there are two versions of this. If the speaker is using a polysemous word, the hearer might latch onto an unintended sense of the word. And if the speaker is just using a non-polysemous word in one of its in an ad hoc way, and the hearer might actually fail to construct the intended ad hoc concept. So that's one broad category failure to recognize. And there's a different kind of failure. It's a more kind of sinister kind of, cooperative kind of failure. As a hearer might actually successfully recognize what the speaker intended, the interpretation intended by the speaker, but fail to adopt. The hearer might not want to go along with the meaning intended by the speaker. So I'm going to say a lot more about these two conditions. Just a clarification, I'm going to be very quick on this. I don't intend this to be an exhaustive analysis of verbal disputes. Verbal disputes can occur in all sorts of different ways. I'm thinking about characteristic ones. And so I'm thinking about cases where a word is either polysemous or where a speaker is using a word to express an ad hoc concept. Some of you have a handout. So there are 3 cases. I'm going to walk you through 3 cases, candidate cases of verbal disputes. I'm going to focus on condition 1 here. So the first case is called Prosecco. So this is less technical. Judy travels from Melbourne to visit her friend Bruno in Florence. Bruno shows Judy all the lovely wines that Italy has to offer. Over a glass of Prosecco, the following in conversation occurs. Judy says, "I prefer Australian Prosecco." Bruno says, "What? Australia couldn't possibly make Prosecco." Judy then says, "Australians have been producing Prosecco for years. It's the exact same product." But by definition, Prosecco is from northern Italy. There's a village called Prosecco, and the sparkling wine Prosecco comes from there. And then Judy says, "Look, other countries can have Prosecco too. The word Prosecco is literally written on wine bottles in Australia." Judy then shows Bruno a picture of a bottle of Australian Prosecco on her phone, and Bruno then says, "I see. I thought the word Prosecco is like the word champagne. I guess it's not. I must try Australian Prosecco when I visit you next year." Okay. Interestingly, Australia has been negotiating a free trade deal with the EU, and they couldn't agree on words like Prosecco and feta. Okay. So this is the case, at least the conversation started with the case of a verbal dispute. The domain of concern here is with respect to whether Australia makes Prosecco. And presumably, Judy and Bruno don't disagree over whether Australia has this thing which Australians call Prosecco, and it comes from the same type of grape as the Italian counterpart. That seems to be something they don't disagree on. And the dispute seems to boil down to a discrepancy in how they use the word Prosecco. Bruno obviously does not use Prosecco to refer to Australian sparkling wine, whereas Judy does. So one way to think about this is that, let's say Judy and Bruno share the same language, and let's say Prosecco is an English word. And the original sense might be the sense that picks out a narrow extension, sparkling wine from Italy only. And then within Australian English speakers, this word gets broadened. The meaning gets broadened to pick out Australian Proseccos as well as other types of Proseccos. Okay. So you can think of this as a kind of polysemy, interesting kind of polysemy where subgroups of speakers use the same word in different senses. Okay. But this case does not involve any substantive disagreement. So once the term gets clarified, and there's no dispute anymore. So it's a case of a merely verbal dispute. Now, I think verbal disputes can involve substantive disagreements as well. Second case, called Boiling. Luca's brother Bernard is a pedantic character and always uses words precisely. Consider the following conversation between Luca and Bernard on a hot summer day. Luca says, I am boiling. Bernard says, you are not. You can't possibly be boiling. I am. It's too hot. But you are not literally boiling, are you? And then Luca realizes, my gosh, you're pedantic. You know that's not what I meant when I say I was boiling. And Bernard says, well, how was I supposed to know what you meant? One ought to use one's words precisely, okay? So this is a case of a verbal dispute again. The domain of concern is with respect to Luca's bodily feeling, but presumably Luca and Bernard don't disagree over whether Luca is very hot, right? And this dispute seems to boil down to how they use the word boiling. Luca uses boiling to express an ad hoc concept. It's like the case of freezing. You know, England is freezing in April. So Luca uses boiling to mean very hot. It's a kind of case of broadening. And Bernard obviously used the same word to mean at or near boiling point only. So this case involves a substantive disagreement, and the disagreement is metalinguistic. So they disagree on how the word boiling ought to be used, right? Luca is much more relaxed than Bernard on how the word ought to be used. So verbal disputes can also involve substantive disagreements. Third case called kill. Tom's partner, Chris, just returned from a month-long trip and finds the rose in the garden dead. Chris accuses Tom of having killed the plant by not watering it. Tom, wanting to avoid blame and responsibility, as he often does, insists that he's not watering the plant, did not kill the rose, but the hot weather did. Here's their conversation. Chris says, you killed the plant. I didn't. I had nothing to do with it. You should have watered it, but you didn't. If you had watered it, it would not have died. I'm sorry that our rose plant is dead, but you shouldn't be blaming me for it. The weather has been abnormally hot. The hot weather killed it, not me. The neighbor's rose didn't die and ours did. Didn't occur to you to water it when it's been so hot in the last month? The weather didn't kill the plant. You did. No, I didn't. Okay. Now, does this case involve a verbal dispute? Well, so let's think about it. The domain of concern here is with respect to Tom's admission in relation to the death of the rose plant, okay? There's certainly a substantive disagreement, I think, and it's a non-linguistic one. It's to do with whether Tom is blameworthy and responsible for the death of the plant. And there's also a dispute about whether Tom's admission should be described, whether Tom has killed the plant. That's the dispute, right? And then you might think that dispute might boil down, or at least depend on how the term kill is used, okay? Why do I say this? Well, in literature on causation, people have made this distinction between causation in the counterfactual sense and causation in the production sense, and these are two different different kinds of metaphysical relations. And in the production sense, the cause has to be in the production history that leads up to the target event, the effect. So usually the cause is spatial-temporally related to the target. So insofar as kill has something to do with causing to die, you might think there are two senses of the word kill. So in a way, Tom has killed the plant in the kind of counterfactual sense. The death of the plant counterfactually depended on Tom's admission. But there's a sense that Tom didn't kill the plant. Namely, Tom's admission did not directly produce the target event. Okay, so what produced the target event? The arid condition of the soil, which is directly caused by the hot weather. Okay, so in terms of the conversation itself, Chris, it's pretty clear. I think Chris is homing on to the counterfactual sense. It's less clear what Tom has in mind, but it's not. Tom talks about hot weather, right? The hot weather killed it, not me. It's not implausible to think that Tom is sort of switching to this kind of direct production sense of kill. So one way to think about it, if this is a kind of verbal dispute, you can think of the word kill and many other verbs as well as an underspecified kind of general meaning that can be narrowed to express distinct ad hoc concepts. Kill in the kind of counterfactual sense and kill in the kind of production sense. And people have made this move with respect to causal talks as well. Okay. All right, so far I have been focusing on condition One, a speaker in many instances of verbal disputes, a speaker is either using a polysmos word in one of its conventionalized senses or using a word to communicate an ad hoc concept that is different from the lexically encoded meaning. So in a good case of communication, in a successful case, the hearer can successfully form a mental representation of the interpretation, the meaning intended by the speaker. But verbal disputes are communicative failures. And there are two types of failures. One is what I call failure to recognize. So in this case, the speaker intends a particular interpretation, intends their word in a particular way. And the hearer fails to form a correct representation of the meaning intended. And so this will be the case of Prosecco, right? So Judy says she prefers Australian Prosecco, right? And Bruno has a different concept of Prosecco, and he fails to latch onto Judy's kind of intended sense of the word Prosecco. There's another kind of failure, which is what I call failure to adopt. So in the case of a failure to adopt, the speaker intends a particular interpretation with the utterance, but the hearer actually forms the correct mental representation of the meaning intended, but they refuse to go along with it. They fail to adopt it. Okay. To adopt the meaning is to, there are different ways to adopt a particular meaning. You can use the word in the same way as intended by the speaker in the rest of the conversation, or you might carry out the conversation in a way that shows your agreement with the intended meaning from the speaker. So boiling is potentially is a very clear case of failure to adopt. It's given Luca is not at boiling point, it's pretty clear that Bernard forms the correct interpretation of Luca's utterance, but he just doesn't want to go along with it. And kill is potentially another case. Tom might have formed the correct mental representation of the meaning intended by Chris in the kind of counterfactual sense, but he doesn't want to go along with it. Okay. I'm going to say a lot more about these two kinds of failures. So I want to spend some time to think a bit more about why and how these failures occur. Okay. People with me? Oh, good. Okay. All right. Failure to recognize. So here I'm going to use, so the question is, why do these failures occur? And I'm going to use relevance theory, which is a post-Gricean inferential theory of communication put forward by psychologist Dan Sperber and linguist Deirdre Wilson. And so I've been talking about ad hoc concepts. Much of the literature on ad hoc concepts actually come from relevance theorists. So on relevance theory, a speaker's utterance is an overt demand for attention from the hearer. And the utterance, just like any other inputs in our environment, can generate a bunch of cognitive effects. By cognitive effects, I mean something like, they can make changes to our representations of the world. Okay. So for instance, an utterance can eliminate a previously held assumption that the hearer might have. It might strengthen or revise a previously held assumption. And very importantly, we can draw contextual implications from the utterance, including implications about the speaker's intention. So when I say Phelps is not human, in that particular context, you can draw the implication, you can draw the contextual implication that I think very highly of Michael Phelps. Okay, so relevance theory also posits this assumption that human cognition has evolved to maximize the trade-off between cognitive effects and processing cost. Okay, so processing inputs in our environment come with costs as well. They give effects, but also come with costs. So when it comes to the utterance, so we have to go for, construct an interpretation. The hearer expects the utterance to yield, to give us a interpretation that generates worthwhile cognitive effects without unnecessary expenditure of processing effort. And so when you hear an utterance, naturally, the interpretation you will go for is the interpretation that requires the least processing effort. So that would be the most accessible interpretation available. And a hearer would only reconsider the interpretation if the initial interpretation fails to yield sufficient cognitive effects, or if there's other evidence for an alternative interpretation. Okay. So now going back to cases of failure to recognize. So in these scenarios, the speaker intends a particular interpretation of, let's assume that the speaker is cooperative, they intend a particular interpretation of the utterance, but the hearer fails to latch on to that interpretation, and the hearer actually constructs a different interpretation, and that interpretation generates a contradiction for the hearer, and as a result, they reject utterance, and then you get verbal dispute. So just the first bit of exchange in the case of Prosecco, Judy says, I prefer Australian Prosecco. Bruno says, what? Australia couldn't possibly make Prosecco. Okay. There's a lot happening in Bruno's head before he makes this response. So obviously, this is a case of a verbal dispute. Bruno has this concept Prosecco, which only picks out sparkling wine from Italy. And Judy has a different concept, Prosecco star, let's call it. And it picks out a broader kind of extension, bigger, so including Australian Prosecco as well. Now, Bruno doesn't know that Judy has this broader concept. And the interpretation Bruno has when he hears Judy's utterance, the first interpretation he homes on to, the least effortful one, is interpretation U1. Judy prefers Australian Prosecco. Here, Prosecco is the first concept, sparkling wine made in Italy. Okay, that's the interpretation Bruno constructs of Judy's utterance. And U1 entails that Australia makes Prosecco. So that just follows from U1, E. Again, Prosecco is the first concept, okay, not the second one. But E generates a contradiction. E comes in conflict with Bruno's previously held assumption, namely, only Italy makes Prosecco, okay? And this assumption comes from Bruno's concept of Prosecco, okay? And as a result, so there's a contradiction. As a result, Bruno rejects Judy's claim and makes the response, what Australian couldn't possibly make Prosecco. So there's kind of some kind of inferential steps happening in Bruno's head, right? So what's interesting is that when the interpretation of the speaker's utterance contradicts a prior assumption of the speaker, of the hearer can do a bunch of different kinds of things. One is if the hearer has low confidence in their previously held assumption, they might reject the assumption and then come to endorse the speaker's claim on that particular interpretation. A second option is that if the hearer has high confidence in their assumption, and they would naturally maintain the assumption and reject the speaker's claim on that interpretation. And that's what Bruno did, okay? This assumption that only Italy makes Prosecco. And he maintains that assumption and rejects Judy's claim. And there's also a third option that a hearer might actually construct an alternative interpretation such that the speaker's claim on the new interpretation no longer contradicts the assumption that the hearer holds. So you resolve the kind of conflict. And this would happen if an alternative interpretation is not particularly effortful, basically. So there's a question why Bruno doesn't construct an alternative interpretation here. So for instance, the intended interpretation is Judy prefers Australian Prosecco star. So that would get rid of the conflict with assumption A. So why doesn't Bruno do this? Well, given we have to balance processing cost and cognitive effort, and the answer simply is U2. That interpretation incurs significant processing cost in comparison to U1. Indeed, Judy hasn't given Bruno any clue that she uses the term Prosecco in a different way. Okay, so it's supposed to be a very simple picture. The intended interpretation is very, very costly. That's the gist of the story. But I'm trying to spell out the steps. Okay, now so. In general, it's in the speaker's interest to provide adequate contextual information for the hearer to latch on to the intended kind of interpretation. But in verbal disputes, speakers often fail to provide sufficient contextual information for all sorts of different reasons, right? But sometimes the fault also lies with the hearer. Yes. The hearer might expect the speaker to use words in a certain way. The hearer might not be paying a close attention to the speaker, right? So think about, I don't know if you know Piers Morgan's type of interviews, doesn't really pay attention to the speaker. And the hearer might even hold a hostile, combative attitude towards the speaker, such that they have the tendency to interpret the speaker in a way that allows them to start an argument. So in all these cases, the speaker's intended meaning is not easily accessible to the hearer, and so constructing the intended interpretation will incur significant effort on the part of the hearer. Okay, so that's the first types of failure. Failure to recognize is explained in terms of processing cost. And second type of failure, failures to adopt. So in these kind of cases, the speaker intends a particular meaning, and the hearer actually forms a correct representation of the meaning, actually latches onto the meaning, but doesn't adopt it, okay? They carry on the conversation in a way that doesn't align with the speaker's intended meaning. So this boiling case, I'm boiling. Bernard says, you're not, you can't possibly be boiling. Again, I'm gonna spell out the details here. There's a lot going on in Bernard's head before he utters this response. So given the weather is hot, given Luca is clearly not at boiling point, Bernard successfully, most likely, Bernard successfully recognizes Luca's intended meaning and constructs interpretation U3. Luca is boiling star, meaning very hot, okay? And given Bernard's assumption about the meaning of boiling and his normative assumption about how the word ought to be used, in that particular context, he can draw the contextual implication that Luca ought to use the word boiling in, or ought not to use the word boiling in that particular way, okay? Now, if Bernard were to engage in good faith, he would have simply corrected Luca and say, oh, I don't like the way you use the word boiling. But instead, Bernard engages in bad faith and switches to his preferred use of the word boiling, namely constructing a different interpretation of Luca's utterance. Luca is boiling, meaning here at boiling point, okay? And then with that particular interpretation, Bernard rejects Luca's claim, interpreted as U4, and then you get a verbal dispute, and Luca comes back and says, yes, I am very hot, and the weather's too hot. I am boiling, and it's very hot. And then you get verbal dispute. So a theory like relevance theory isn't really set up to explain this kind of cases. So relevance theory is primarily concerned with the cognitive process of interpretation rather than cognitive processes that drive post-interpretation interactions. So we have to look elsewhere for a kind of way to theorize about these types of failures. One potential framework is the question on the discussion framework from linguist Craig Roberts. So Roberts follow Stoneacre in assuming that the primary goal of discourse is communal inquiry. So when we are engaging in a conversation, we're trying to make attempts to discover and share with the other interlocutors information about our world. You might very well question this assumption. And she takes the discourse to be structured around a set of questions which can be answered through information exchange between interlocutors. And these questions themselves come in a kind of hierarchical structure, and they're organized in terms of super questions and sub questions. So imagine you and I deciding where to go for dinner tonight, right? And imagine I ask you this question, do you like Chinese food? So me introducing that sub question is a way to answer the super question, where should we go for dinner? And a full answer to the sub question will at least give us a partial answer to the super question, where should we go for dinner? Okay. And the question on the discussion is the accepted question that represents the immediate topic of the discourse. Okay. Now, I think failures to adopt can be viewed as uncooperative endeavors where disputants are not cooperative agents in information exchange, but deliberately make attempts to address different questions in order to change discourse structure. Again, the simple toy example about boiling. Bernard says, you can't possibly boiling. He's addressing this question, is Luca at boiling point? Okay. And what about Luca's utterance, I'm boiling? It seems to be addressing a different question. How is Luca feeling, right? So what is the question on the discussion here? Well, the question on the discussions are usually determined by prosodic emphasis, focus, as well as context. So think about how you would utter the sentence, I'm boiling on a hot summer day, right? The emphasis will be on boiling. It's not I am boiling. We're not asking who is boiling. We're not asking whether Luca is really boiling. We're asking how Luca is feeling, right? The emphasis will naturally be on boiling. And furthermore, in this particular context, the fact that Luca is not at boiling point is taken for granted. It's part of the common ground. So clearly the question on the discussion here is Luca very hot? So we can view Bernard as making an uncooperative conversational move to shift the conversation into a different question about whether Luca is at boiling point. So that's a very simple toy example, obviously. So there's a question about, why do interlocutors do this in a conversation? So why might interlocutors change the discourse to address different questions? So here I'm going to follow my good friend Jessica Kaiser's work, especially in her recent book, Non-Ideal Foundations of Language. So in contrast to this kind of picture you get from Stolnaker, Kaiser argues that interlocutors have complex goals in conversational exchange, which go far beyond information exchange. So for instance, Bernard has the metalinguistic goal of using words in ways that he deems correct, but he doesn't have the didactic goal of explicitly correcting people, right? Think about Tom, the killing plant case. Tom has the personal goal of avoiding blame and responsibility, right? So as interlocutors, we make conversational moves in order to fulfill these conversational goals. And this requires us to monitor lots of things. And certainly we have to monitor what is said by the speaker, what is implied, whether what is communicated by the speaker coheres with our own interests and the beliefs. And a big part of this is actually monitoring the implications of words. So before I said, concepts come with bodies of information, right? Think about this example of kill. Kill, the word kill carries significant weight. The tokening of the concept kill is going to trigger, make accessible related logical and encyclopedic entries associated with the concept kill. So one encyclopedic entry associated with the concept kill is that an act of killing usually entails taking responsibility for the act itself. So think about an interlocutor like Tom, whose goal is to avoid responsibility and blame. And naturally, in that particular context, that piece of information is going to be easily accessible. So it is in his interest not to not have his omission being described as an act of killing. And that to avoid that, you would naturally change the discourse somewhat by using the word in a different sense, okay, in the kind of production sense. Okay, yeah, I can have some more. Yeah, so now I want to look at some real world examples to draw some implications. I'm going to focus on these two types of failures that I try to identify, or I identified in this talk. So as an example of a verbal dispute in public discourse, I want to think about disputes over whether something is racist. Okay, so the term racist used as an adjective can apply to all sorts of different things: linguistic utterances, actions, policies, institutions. Disputes about whether something's racist can be really far-reaching. So in the article, so this is an article, 2019 article in the Washington Post, which showed that Americans disagreed significantly with respect to whether something is racist. And this disagreement tracks a partisan divide, with the Republicans being twice or three times as likely as Democrats to agree that certain behaviors or views are not racist. So the authors of this study ended the article by saying that when judging what is and is not racist, Republicans and Democrats, Trump supporters and opponents are talking past one another. Okay, so I'm particularly in this case. So this is a case involving a member of the British royal family. So this is Lady Susan Hussey, who was the late Queen's lady in waiting. So at a charity event in 2022, she repeatedly asked a British-born Black charity boss where she was from and where she was really from. And the conversation was extremely awkward and very persistent as well. So many mainstream commentators, as well as politicians, were very quick to label her remarks as racist, but many people also came to her defense. And those who defended her cited her old age and argued that she did not intend to offend or harm, and also argued that her questions were born out of curiosity. I think a case like this can involve both failures to recognize as well as failures to adopt. So let's think about, I think to appreciate how failures to recognize can arise, it might be useful to think about the encoded meaning, the internal structure of the concept racist. So this is an article published recently by Sam Liao and Nat Hansen. So they did a corpus studies, and they argued that the term racist used in ordinary English encodes information about both degrees and dimensions. So racist is a gradable adjective. It can be modified by degree adverbs like slightly racist, very racist, extremely racist. It's a multidimensional adjective. It can be modified by the preposition in some respect or in every respect. His comments were racist in every respect. And importantly, the term racist from their study, the term is a disjunctive multidimensional adjective. What that means is the adjective can be felicitously applied as long as at least one of its dimensions is satisfied. So a good comparison here is the word sick. Sick is a disjunctive multidimensional word. You can be sick in all sorts of different ways, but you just have to be sick in one way to be called sick, right? Sick, headache, or stomach, right? And the healthy is a conjunctive multidimensional word. Got to be healthy in lots of respects, okay? And now, so they don't really go into details about the dimensions, but one thing they mentioned from the corpus study is that people often make this distinction between racist in intent and racist in effect, and these two things obviously come apart. So what I take their study to show is that the standing encoded meaning of the word racist as used in ordinary English encodes this kind of broad meaning, which includes both the intention dimension and the effect dimension, and maybe some other dimensions as well. And these dimensions disjunctively govern the application of the term. So as long as one dimension is satisfied, the threshold for one dimension is satisfied, the thing at issue can be described felicitously as racist. But at the same time, you might think that some speakers of our language actually use the term racist in narrow senses. So maybe some speakers actually represent some dimensions as necessary, right? And so one possibility is that often when people discuss whether something's racist, they tend to focus on intent. So one possibility is that people focus on intent and represent intent as a necessary dimension. So for something to be racist, the intent dimension there has to be an intent to offend or harm based on race, okay? So the narrow sense will pick out a narrow extension where intent has to be present, whereas the broad sense intent doesn't have to be present, okay? So then think about the lady Susan's case, right? People who came to her defense cited her old age and argued that she did not intend to harm, and her questions were born out of curiosity. So you might think that people were really talking past each other, right? Some people just operate on this kind of narrow sense and they fail to latch onto the kind of broad sense. But also, I think, so that's a very charitable explanation of what might be going on. But in cases like this, I think failures to adopt are also very likely, especially in cases of when it comes to value-laden terms like sexist and racist, right? And failures to adopt are likely to be common. So here, what we are thinking of is someone describes Lady Susan's remarks as racist in the kind of broad sense because the effect dimension is satisfied. And then an interlocutor very much latches onto that sense, knows what the speaker is talking about, and is aware indeed that people use this term in the broad, in the broader society, use this term in the broad sense, but they refuse to go along with it and want to use the term racist in the narrow sense, and then go on to deny that Lady Susan's remarks are not racist in this kind of, and then start talking about intent and all these other things. So this is obviously a lack of a cooperation on the part of the interlocutor, and this lack of cooperation can be explained in terms of conversational goals people might have. And as I said earlier, in order to fulfill these goals we might have, a big part of it is to monitor the implications of words. Words like racist obviously come with significant implications. I'm going to skip this bit. Just the last few slides on verbal disputes in philosophy. I think failures to recognize can do indeed frequently occur in conversational settings, especially in conferences. So I'm also a philosopher of mind. I go to conferences on consciousness. People mean different things by consciousness. Sometimes, just innocent failures to recognize. But in extended, more often written debates, failures to adopt are likely to be more common than failures to recognize. Simply because people have more opportunities to clarify what they mean by their terms. And then, so there's a question, there's a lot to say about philosophy, but there's a question about why do failures to adopt occur in philosophy? So it's an empirical question. I'm gonna just give two armchair observations. One is that failures to adopt are often due to substantive disagreement over how the term at issue ought to be understood. So here I have in mind this famous exchange between Sam Harris and Dan Dennett. Very, very quickly, so Harris denies that free will exists, but he adopts this kind of libertarian notion of free will. And Dennett obviously thinks that free will exists. He's a compatibilist, but he adopts this kind of capacity-based way of thinking about free will. And the two of them, they know very well what each other mean by the term free will. And so it's a clear case of a failure to adopt. And their disagreement, they really disagree on how the term free will ought to be understood. And that kind of disagreement, it's manifested at two levels. On one level, they both think it's important to respect the folk notion of free will, but they disagree over how the folk understands the notion of free will. So Harris thinks that folk adopts this kind of libertarian notion, whereas Dennett disagrees. But even if it turns out that the folk has this kind of libertarian notion, Dennett thinks that the capacity notion ought to be preserved. And so they disagree. At a second level, they disagree over how one should conceptually engineer the term and improve on the notion, on the folk notion itself. And this, in relation to this, you might think, why do philosophers care about how a word is understood, or how a phrase is understood? Some possibilities here. One is to do with theoretical commitments. Dennett is very much an ordinary language, what comes from an ordinary language philosophy background. He was a student of Ryle. He does care about how the folk use the term free will, and he wants to preserve as much as folk psychology as possible. And the second point is that I think which meaning we adopt makes a difference, makes an impact on what we say about issues in the vicinity, and the kind of questions are likely to be foregrounded. So that's why people might care about how the word ought to be understood. So here's a very lovely quote from Chalmers. The accepted meaning for a key term will make a difference to which concepts are highlighted, which questions can be easily raised, and which associations and inferences are naturally made. And this is, very much so in the case. He made this comment in the context of talking about free will, and questions about moral responsibility will naturally get raised. Depends on the notion of free will you adopt. So that's one reason. Why do failures to adopt occur in philosophy? Substantive disagreements over how the term at issue ought to be understood. There's a kind of lighthearted suggestion, namely, interlocutors just have attachment to their views, including views about how a word ought to be understood. So I'm going to end with a quote from Timothy Williamson. Like defense and prosecution lawyers, philosophers often argue for what others see as a lost cause. The reason is different, though. Typically, they become over-attached to their own ideas. This is not a peculiarity of philosophers. It is a natural human trait. With pardonable exaggeration, the great physicist Max Planck said that truth triumphs in science, not because its opponents are won over, but because they die. Okay, that's all I have. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Michelle. And we will take questions. I'll start up here and then I'll raise up another sub too.
Thanks very much. That was great. I just had a question though about, you seem to sort of want to proliferate meanings. So you make these terms ambiguous, and if you can kind of imagine the context multiplying indefinitely. So you end up with terms being multiply ambiguous. And I'm just wondering why prefer that to say a picture of implication, so when whatever her name is says about Phelps, he's not human. What she says is literally false, but in the context it implies some other proposition which is true, and then you kind of have some lexical stability, which of course can drift, right? There can always semantic drift over time, and people can argy-bargy about how the term should be understood, right? Or they can take it to court, like in the case of Champagne.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering, and I guess one of the reasons why I worry about the ambiguity is that, everybody's right, right? Because they have their own meaning, and so you can't kind of account for the fact so easily about people just being wrong about things, So anyway, thoughts.
Yeah, I don't need the microphone.
Oh, you don't
but,
need the mic.
Yeah, I've got it.
Some-
So just on the Michael Phelps case, so the Gricean interpretation is that he said, oh, I've said something false, right? And I've implied something true, namely he's excellent, blah, 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 blah. So I'm deliberately not adopting that picture. There are reasons, but also, so the picture I'm thinking about is the ad hoc concept itself contributes to the truth conditional content of the sentence, he's not human. So I'm actually saying something true here. Okay. Yeah. Because it allows, so give me this notion of ad hoc concept, which allow me to give some kind of analysis of a characteristic instance of verbal disputes with people. So if you think that ad hoc concepts often happen, we take a word to express an ad hoc concept, and then the natural thing to think, sometimes we have communicative failures when people fail to latch this concept or don't want to adopt that concept. So that's just the kind of conceptual tools I need to think about verbal disputes and then think about conversation exchange and failures. So it's the kind of theoretical assumption that I'm just taking for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for really illuminating talk. My question was that a verbal dispute's kind of two-way, but then these failures to recognize or adopt are sort of a single agent thing. So is it a possibility that a verbal dispute could rely both on a failure to adopt and then a responsive failure to recognize? Because that's what I thought was happening in the Boiling case, that Bernard was refusing to adopt, but maybe Luca didn't realize and was just failing to recognize, and both could explain it and either could be a solution.
Yeah, that sounds right. So I've been focusing on just the hero side, right? Speaker could be doing all sorts of different things as well. In fact, you think about Bernard. Bernard is not making his meaning clear at all, deliberately not making his meaning clear to Luca, which contributes to Luca's, sort of misinterpretation. So it definitely, so I try to, this did bother me because sometimes it's to do with the speaker. Yeah, thanks.